I know you will.
All right, then. Green to this. No,
Hello, hello. Test, test, 1, 2, 3.
ready then. You guys.
Yeah, here's the title we want. Just like that.
Yeah.
Can you put that in there like that?
I
Here. Tips, Tariffs, Green, Bob Oxley, and then the date.
Oxley have green tariffs down here.
That's good enough.
All right.
Yep, that's good enough.
You guys are off and running.
Hello, everybody. It's time for tips, topics, issues, and positions. And welcome back for another week of interesting information coming out. And today we're looking at a topic of tariffs. And we are fortunate to once again have Professor Joe Green from the History and Political Science Department here at Dixie State University to join us and give us his idea and explanation of what a tariff is. We're going to start off real simple, and we're going to move into tariffs that under the Trump administration, what they're proposing, and the curiosity is what is that going to have as far as an effect on the American public, not only today, but in the near future. So, Professor Green, welcome back to the studio here at Dixie State University.
Nice to be here, Bob.
Yep. And so you heard my introduction. We're looking at tariffs today, and there's been a lot of questions, a lot of input from our audience, listening audience and viewing audience, asking about, hey, this tariff thing, how is that going to affect me? Is it going to? What about my quality of life? What about purchasing power? Is that going to change? And there's a lot of confusion out there. So that's why I brought one of the experts here on Dixie State campus, you, to come in. And I guess to start with, which we always do here at TIPS when we have a topic, can you just give us a brief overview of when they use the word tariffs? What is it, and why would a country impose that on another country? Just real simple.
A tariff is a tax, Bob, a tax on goods coming into the country from a foreign country. So it's a tax on imports. Okay. The reason given for tariff, there are a number of reasons given for tariffs. The president uses almost all of them. They're almost all bogus. One would be one that he's using specifically to enact the tariffs he's using now is a national security power that the Congress has granted to the president to, if he finds that we're being affected by national security, then he can impose tariffs on goods coming from another country in order to make sure that that we're producing the goods we would need in order to engage in a war. So the president has said that we need to be making our own steel. It would be stupid to, I think that's his word, to rely on any foreign country to make our steel if we ever got into a war, because they could stop making it up for us, or they could be cut off some way. We might get in a fight with them, and then where would we be? Okay. The other main reason that the president gives is because he thinks we're losing in something called the trade deficit. We should talk more deeply about that in the program, Bob. Okay. That's something that's basic economics that he does not understand. His original Treasury Secretary resigned because he couldn't get him to understand that the trade deficit is not a legitimate issue. The national debt, the fiscal deficit, where we spend more than we take in, is a big national problem. The trade deficit is not. It's a misuse of the word deficit.
Wow.
So those would be two of the main reasons why countries might want to impose tariffs.
As far as the U.S. history is concerned, any time that we've implemented tariffs, did they work? And did they indeed improve the quality of life for American citizens?
This is a really, like all social phenomena, this is a really difficult issue to try to figure out, to get research and data and all of that. The very best book on it is a fairly new one. I think it's about a year old, by Professor Irwin at Dartmouth University, who's one of our leading experts on trade. Paul Krugman of the New York Times, just as an aside, is also a leading expert on trade and agrees with Professor Irwin. His book, Against the Tide, says that when we were a big imposer of tariffs in the 19th century, in the very first administration, Washington's administration, Alexander Hamilton argued that we should try to protect our infant industries by imposing tariffs. The followers of Hamilton have been the dominant, on and off the dominant political movement in the United States, and especially after the Civil War, after Lincoln, who was a Hamiltonian, we used tariffs right up until Franklin Roosevelt. The nation was a leading tariff user in the world, one of the leading ones in the world. And Professor Irwin's research, this new book that's really comprehensive about this, his conclusion is that it ended up hurting us, hurting consumers. Now, the United States grew during that whole period. Incomes went up. Great industries were built. But we would have been even richer and even better off had the United States and the Republican Party in those days not relied on tariffs.
Wow. All right. Let's go right into with President Trump. We earlier this year, 2018, President Trump just arbitrarily said we're going to have tariffs on our allies. We're going to have tariffs on those that are projected enemies of the state. We're just going to have tariffs worldwide and protect us.
Using the national security power that he has.
That's right. That's exactly what he did.
Yeah. Suddenly Canada is a national security threat.
Yes. Who on July the 1st came back at us and said, we're going to impose our tariffs on the U.S. on goods and services. Give me your opinion on and your position on this just carte blanche implementation of tariffs on all of these countries worldwide. And then with that, in the same breath that you brought up Canada, NAFTA, he doesn't like NAFTA. He doesn't like any agreements. The president has indicated that we should implement tariffs across the board. Is there any reason that you've identified as to really why we want to do this and disrupt the world like we are?
This is going to be a long answer, Bob.
Give it to me. That's what we're on the air for. This is tips.
Okay. Let's see if I can get remember all of the threads and keep them together. You ask the basic question is, you ask me why. I've listened to Mr. Trump as he's been interviewed when he was Mr. Trump, when he was interviewed on the cable channels when they started, on PBS before that. I've listened to him for 30 years, and he believes that the trade deficit means that other countries are winning and we're losing. That is, if we import more than we export, somehow that makes us losers because we're not selling as many goods to other countries as they're selling to us. Somehow there should be an even balance, would be his claim. Now, the trade deficit is really, from this perspective, misnamed. Back in the 30s and 40s, in order to deal with the Great Depression, the United States got some economists together and began trying to collect all of the national economic data so we could tell how we were doing,
yes.
Whether we were growing or whether we weren't, to give us kind of an indication, hey, are things turning down? Do we need to What do we need to do so we don't get in this Great Depression kind of situation again? And the national accounts were created, okay, where you go in and you add up all of the goods and services that we produce in the United States in a year. That's called the gross. It's called the gross national product originally. They modified some ways that they calculate it. We now use the gross domestic product. All the goods and services that we produce in the United States. Well, when you do that, you add up all the goods and services that we start producing in January, and you keep adding them until we get to December. And then you say, well, that's the dollar amount of all the goods and services we produced in a year. And then we compare that to last year and next year to see how we're doing. And if it's going up, then we must be doing better off. If we're going down, then now there's some issues with that and so on, but it's the standard way that macroeconomists try to assess how we're doing. That's the National Bureau of Economic Research. That's part of the way that they determine whether we're in a recession. Well, when we're making these national accounts, you have to say, if we sold any of the goods we made in the United States to a foreign country, they need to be counted as part of the goods that we made because Americans were working, American businesses produced those goods, but you can't count the goods that we purchased from another country. Let's subtract those out. And the idea that you use a subtraction created the idea that somehow is a deficit. But all it is subtracting the goods we didn't make. Okay?
Got it.
All right.
Okay.
So it is not a good representation of whether the United States is winning or losing when we determine whether we want to buy goods from another country. Now, as you know, Bob, I'm a free market guy, okay? I like for people to be able to engage in their lives without a lot of government interference. Now, we've got to have the police, and we've got to have judges, and we've got to have national security, and we probably need the government to help us fund education and help protect the environment and things like that. They're minimal things, but most of the kinds of things that someone like me wants the government to be doing is to mainly kind of set up the rules of the game and then stay out of things and let me and everybody else do basically what we want as long as we don't engage in force or fraud against anybody, okay? So I ought to be able to choose whether to start a business, and there shouldn't be a lot of heavy-duty regulations and so on, somebody telling me what I can do and what bunch of fees. I ought to be able to start a business. And we know from macroeconomic research that those nations where it's easy to start a business, where there isn't a lot of regulation, are rich. They tend to be the rich countries. And where it's really difficult, where you have to pay a bribe or lots of fees or there's some regulations you have to deal with, then that tends to reduce the total amount of economic growth. So the reason I want people to be free to engage in capitalist acts with other adults, that's Bob Nozick, the famous political philosopher, is because it makes America richer. It makes the world richer. So our taxes ought to be low, and President Trump's done a wonderful job lowering the taxes. Our regulations ought to be pushed back. He's done a wonderful job doing that. The rules of the game ought to be easy to understand, and we ought to know what they are ahead of time. He's appointing judges that will do that. But when it comes to me deciding whether the good I want to buy is made in Utah or whether it's made in Nevada, that's something that the government shouldn't interfere with, okay? Because the way that economic activity works is we can choose to be self-sufficient, which means we'll be poor. If I have to make everything that I possibly use, I would have no car, I would have no cell phone, I would have no house, at least not like the one that I have with indoor plumbing and all of that, simply because that requires a huge amount of knowledge and expertise that I can't possibly get if I'm trying to build it all myself. There's a really good YouTube video about a guy trying to build his own toaster. I mean, mining the metals and, and all of that, and it's a mess and takes him 5 years and so on. So what we do is we specialize. Each of us specializes in certain kinds of things, and then we trade with somebody else for the other goods that we want. And when you do that, the economics is as clear on this as economics is clear about anything. You increase the total amount of goods. You make people wealthier. You make them better off. You improve their lives, their standard of living, and nations get rich. That's the fundamental principle for nations getting rich. You need some other stuff. You and I have talked about some of that, but that's the fundamental thing. Okay. And it means that I get to buy what I want from whomever I want to buy it from. And so if I don't want to make it myself and somebody in town is making it, I don't want to do my own horseshoes, say, before the era of the automobile, and I go to my blacksmith. But if I want to buy a ready-made dress that they only do in New York City, then I order it from Sears Roebuck, and they send it on okay? And this is just kind of the way it works. And if I want to buy my tennis shoes, because, I don't have unlimited amounts of money, I've got to kind of conserve the money that I have so that I get the most satisfaction and standard of living out of it. And I don't really want to pay $50 for the tennis shoes I want to use. And if someone in Taiwan or China made them for $20, I'm way better off if I engage in a trade with them. And they're way better off because instead of living out on a rice paddy like their ancestors did, where half of them are dying before they reach the age of 5 and that kind of thing, they can move into a city and work in a factory. And even if it sounds a little bit like a sweatshop, they prefer it. They tend to think it's way better because they're getting a wage and they're able to educate their kids. And this is just kind of the way that, nations get rich. We both end up better off, okay? So trade does not occur between nations. The United States does not trade with China. I trade with somebody in China who's making me shoes. Or if I buy an iPhone, I trade with somebody in China who's making 4% of the value of an iPhone. They're assembling it there, okay? And I get a cheaper iPhone, therefore I can afford it, okay? And since I can afford a cheaper iPhone, I have other money that I can use, which to buy other goods and services in the economy, which creates a huge number of jobs and those other things that wouldn't be there if I had to pay an extra $20 or $50 for my iPhone that I then can't use in order to buy something else. So in the United States, we get to specialize, and we're the leading manufacturer of things in the world, okay? Our manufacturing employment's been going down because we're so efficient, okay, so technologically advanced that we produce oodles more stuff with fewer and fewer people. That's been what we've been doing since the country was founded, okay? And we have this huge standard of living. But when the government comes in and says, I'm going to tax you, I'm going to make you pay a higher rate of taxes on that good coming in from a foreign country, yes, that means that I now, just as in the example I gave you, I have less money now to buy those other things, and that's going to affect jobs in every one of those other industries, okay? Now, I sent you something yesterday which has some data in it, okay, that indicates that Mr. Trump's, the first tariffs he announced were 25% on steel coming into the country and 10% on aluminum, okay? And I'm going to read this, okay?
Please do. Yeah, it's very interesting.
There are 170,000 jobs in the United States right now making raw steel, okay? But there are, as we speak, 6.5 million jobs that in businesses that use steel, most of which comes from other countries, Canada, okay, Japan, the European Union, They've all been our allies. If I remember right, they all helped us fight World War I and World War II. Those were the countries that were with us in Korea, and some of them were with us in Vietnam. Canada was with us all of the way most of the time in those things. They don't seem to represent a national security threat. We have an unguarded border, 4,000-mile border with Canada that's unguarded because we're not worried about Canadian invasion. I don't think Canada's worried about American invasion, okay? But if they happen to have entrepreneurs and people who are better at making raw steel at some place in Canada, maybe because they're closer to natural resources or energy sources and things, and we in our country have people who will bring that raw steel in, modify it in some way, and then sell it. That's a job, okay? It's a job dependent on a product that comes from a foreign country, but it's a job. And there are 6.5 million of those jobs compared to 170,000 of the jobs making the raw steel in the United States right now. To get back to the ideal that, let's see, the first guy I heard talk about this was Pat Buchanan, and then Ross Perot, and then President Trump, that somehow we get back to the 1950s when we made 40% of the world's steel or something. Those factories aren't there anymore. They were inefficient. They've been outcompeted by way more modern, first in Japan, then in Brazil, Canada, and all of that. And then we bring the stuff in. These are the supply chains that you hear about on television. And they're extremely complex, and they're extremely complicated, okay? And they've been set up over many years. They're very difficult to change. And what happens is when you cut off the original supply of that steel by saying, hey, we're going to raise your price, okay,
Yes.
then suddenly you've got a company that had contracts for Canadian steel that now has no way to get the steel because you just raised their costs, okay?
Right.
Now, this isn't tangential because it impacts literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of other companies that company is dealing with, okay? When it starts to lay off workers, okay?
Because of the contracts being nullified, canceled?
Yeah.
So we're talking about...
Or because they have to pay the higher tariff, the 25% tariff, and suddenly their costs are now higher than the company that's, for selling. There's a nail company in Missouri that I was reading about that's going to lay off 500 people because they can't get their raw material steel. And they make nails other places. They make them in Brazil. They make them in Japan. And so if you want to buy nails now, you're not going to buy from this company because its prices are higher thanks to the tariff. So you'll buy it from a company in France, or you'll buy it from a company in Brazil, or you'll buy it from a company in Canada, or somewhere else where they also make probably China, where they also make the nails. And suddenly this company's out of business. 500 employees are gone. That affects the whole community where that company is.
Exactly.
It affects all of the suppliers to that company who now have to scramble because here's one of their main customers who isn't buying their stuff anymore. There are layoffs that are going to happen there. It literally puts millions of jobs at risk to apply the tariffs. On top of that, it makes every American poorer because we're paying a higher tax now on everything that has steel in it, okay? Price of washing machines, that was one of the early tariffs, has gone up 16% in the United States in 2 months. Now, if you're in the middle class, maybe you can handle 16% increase on your next washer. If you're poor, you can't handle it. It just took it right out of your budget. Walmart isn't going to have that washing machine that you depended on getting. And so it's undermined your standard of living, your quality of living. It's really hard on the poor. This is a very regressive tax, a tax on the poor, okay? It's not fair, and it won't work, okay? You can't win. You can't just say, well, trade wars are easy to win, okay? No war is easy to win, okay? Things are way too complicated. every nation that got into World War I thought it'd be over in 6 weeks and they would be the winners. And 4 years later, and 17 million dead, nobody, as far as I can tell, was the winner.
Yeah, I just was thinking back what you're saying, and focusing on the steel industry. Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't there a time whereby historically the U.S. imposed a tariff on steel to allow our steel manufacturers here in the United States to modernize so they could be competitive over a 5-year period? It was a 5-year tariff.
That may be the Bush administration, I think.
At the end of the 5 years,
it didn't last 5 years.
The steel industry did not modernize, and so when they took the tariffs down, they were still non-competitive.
I don't know about the steel example that you used. I know President Bush was worried about votes in Pennsylvania and Ohio and imposed a tariff against World Trade Organization rules. The World Trade Organization allowed other countries to threaten tariffs against us, the way that works, and he had to take the tariff off rather than cause all of the problems like the ones that I just went through. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan negotiated a deal with the Japanese that they would limit the number of cars coming into the country for a certain period of time in order to give our car manufacturers a chance to catch up competitively with the kinds of innovations that the Japanese had done in the 1970s. They were building better cars, okay? I got another example about cars, too, that I want to share with you. What happened was we limited the number of small Japanese cars that could come into the country. The net result of that was that American car companies, rather than getting better, simply made deals with Japanese car companies to come and make their car here, and they call it a Fiat, they call it a Fiesta or some other thing, rather than a Camry or a Datsun 210, I think was one of the kinds of things. So you could buy the Japanese car, it just had an American name on it, okay? The other thing that happened was the Japanese were limited in the number of cars they made in Japan that could come to the United States. So they decided to build cars that had a higher return. So if you'd only bring in 1 million cars, instead of bringing in 1 million Datsun 210s, they simply invented a Lexus and Infiniti, which hadn't existed before,
right?
Okay, which are high end, and suddenly Cadillac and Lincoln are now having trouble too. You can't anticipate the way people are going to adjust and react when you put fences, when you put barriers in front of them. They react in ways way different than you ever think they're going to, and usually and for people in our community who are used to talking about how government can't do things, how they get it wrong all of the time, to argue that somehow there are experts in Washington, a businessman who has never run anything, and somehow and who's never been involved with the government, that somehow he can come in and he knows exactly how to do all of this so that it works out for the good of the United States, seems to me, based on the way that I listen to people who talk in this community, way beyond what they normally would accept as credible for what government can do.
Wow. There's a lot to think about. I guess my next question is then, from an American citizen standpoint, that's our listeners and our viewers are looking at this program, and you're the expert here. We need your input. Based on your experience and observations and knowledge, what's going to happen as far as our purchasing power as the average American citizen? You can put it right in the middle class. What do you foresee happening with all of these tariffs that have been imposed, and also the countries that are counterattacking with tariffs? Just to give you an example, this morning, President Trump announced about 72 hours ago that he was going to add another $200 billion of tariffs on the People's Republic of China. And as of this morning, Beijing came out and said, well, we're going to add 5 to 25% tariffs on a number of products. And the two equations was we represented with the tariffs that we're talking about to China was 200 billion, and what Beijing's total, when he did the calculations, came out to about 60 billion. Based on that, okay, and here's some of the logic. I'm going to throw out everything else, and I just want you to talk to it. Based on what you've told us thus far in this show about there's no really a winner when it comes to tariffs, it's a war. My concern is, what does this mean for the American public? Not tomorrow, but 6 months from now. Quality of life, purchasing power, adjustments. As far as like you were saying, the 170,000 of manufacturing jobs, maybe you may say an increase there, but we're going to see an increase in monies for those companies that are selling the product, and that's over 6 million people. What do you foresee for us in the future as far as quality of life? What adjustments do you see that we're going to have to make? And just some examples. I know you can't get very, very specific, but I think the listeners, based on, before we did this show, some of the input that I received, questions saying, would you consider doing a show on tariffs? And I just want to know where I'm going to be a year from now.
Yeah. Social science is notoriously bad at prediction, Bob. Okay. But based on the economic theory that as I know and understand it, okay, you can't put a lid on economic activity and grow, okay? It is my view that the length of the Great Depression was primarily a result of really bad New Deal programs that made it very difficult for businesses to invest and create new factories and jobs and that kind of thing, because of the mountain of government regulation, the increases in taxes, but more than that, the threat of more taxes and more regulations, and the Roosevelt administration's basic war on the competitive economy that it was running. I think after 2008, President Obama did the similar kind of thing, and the net result was the economy during his years didn't grow more than 2%, averaged less than 2% growth in that whole period. Usually we spring back from recessions. In the Great Depression, we didn't. 2008, we didn't, because there's this uncertainty sitting on the people who create our jobs. Okay.
Right.
Now, President Trump undid that, as I mentioned earlier. He brought taxes down, and made it so that businesses understand way more clearly what their bill's going to be into the future. Okay. We've seen a big rollback in regulation. Okay. So that businesses know, hey, if I have a puddle on my over here, or if I emit a little more of something, then I'm not going to have a big fine or anything like that. It makes it so that businesses can project into the future, take a risk, and invest. And the net result we've seen so far is in the 18 months of the Trump administration, we're now averaging nearly 3% growth.
Wow.
Okay?
Okay.
All right. Now, what these tariffs are a lid on the economy that make it very difficult for all of these businesses to know what's going to happen. Because, as you pointed out, we don't know what the next set of tariffs is going to be. You can't plan for anything. The result of that is going to be that businesses probably will begin investing less rather than more. They've been investing more. Now they'll invest less. Fewer jobs, fewer wage increases, and all of that would be the way that I assess it. What I tell my students is this. When you put a tariff on, you help a narrow group of industries, usually ones who lobby really well. President Trump complained about all the lobbyists. Guess where they're coming from? They're coming out of the woodwork, and they're going after his administration. Give me put a tariff on this competitor from Germany. Put a tariff on this competitor, or give me a break. Give me so that I don't have to follow this tariff or that tariff. Everybody's having to come out of the woodwork and spend millions and billions of dollars in order to lobby government to get favors that they should be spending on factories and equipment in order to make more jobs for people, okay? So a small group of people end up better off, okay? The 170,000 workers and their industries, the aluminum people you were talking about.
Right,
okay?
right.
All the businesses that deal, that have to buy the good or the services that has a tariff on it, now are harmed. They have higher costs. Higher costs, especially for firms on the margin, mean they're whether they survive or not is up in the air, okay? But for the other firms, their costs ultimately end up in higher prices.
Which is the number 6.5 million that you're referring to.
Yes. And you can expect the price of every good and every good connected with the good that the tariffs go on over the next few years to go up, meaning that even if your income didn't change, you have less, it's like when gas prices go up, you have less money to spend on other things now, and that means that businesses that depend on discretionary spending get in trouble. We don't have as much discretionary money to spend anymore. They're a horrible way to conduct things. Now, you mentioned China. China's a really bad trade actor. They've been stealing our intellectual technology, our intellectual knowledge for years. And we've known it, okay? But we have ways of dealing with this, okay, other than tariffs. There's a system called the WTO. The Obama administration and the Bush administration were looking to China to help in international relations and didn't push as hard as they ought to have in order to get the WTO in line, get the Europeans and so on to, present a united front and say to China, don't do this. We were starting. President Obama was starting this. I generally didn't like I think he was a wonderful man. I didn't like his administration, but he was starting something called TPP,
Right.
which was an attempt to get all of the nations of the Pacific together and to reduce their tariffs so that China, and then say to China, if you want into this market, not just the United States, but Canada and Australia and all, if you want in here, shape up, okay? There are ways to put pressure on China to shape up, and tariffs aren't doing it, okay? A tariff hurts me, a citizen of the United States, okay? When the Chinese respond by putting tariffs, it hurts a Chinese citizen. So we have governments hurting the citizens of each country, and you can see that there's when you get into national politics, you don't want to ever be seen as backing down. That's why they do all of these games with diplomacy about the shape of the table and who's going to sit where. They play all those games because you can't be seen as losing when you're doing diplomacy.
Right.
But trade is not about winning and losing. When I engage in trade with you, if I go down to the store and buy a gallon of milk, okay, nobody lost. The store wanted me to buy the milk, okay? I wanted the milk more than I wanted the money. I'm better off, they're better off. That's what happens with every trade. Trades are conducted between companies, and they're conducted between individuals. They're not conducted between nations.
Very interesting. I hate to say this, but our time has run out.
We didn't even get started, Bob.
As usual. Listen, Professor Green, thank you so much for taking time out and coming in. I'm sure that this has satisfied the number of requests I had before this show from our listeners asking, could you please do a show on tariffs? I don't understand this. I don't know how it works. And more importantly, how is it going to affect my quality of life in the future? And is this worthwhile? I think we've addressed those things. I know that we could talk for hours on this, but we have a limited amount of time on the air. So thank you so much once again for being here and expressing and giving us your positions on the topic of tariffs and the various issues that go along with that topic. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes another show of tips, topics, issues, and positions. Thank you very much for listening, and we're available on Facebook and YouTube and Podbean Podcast, our affiliate there, as well as we're on KDXI 100.3 FM. We'll be on at 3 o'clock on Friday with a rebroadcast at 4:30 p.m. on Saturday. So thanks very much for listening, and looking forward to having you on board with us for the next episode of Tips, Topics, Issues, and Positions. Goodbye now.